Present here and those participating online. Thobela, Molweni, Sanbonani. South Africa, like the rest of the African continent, has been experiencing negative impacts of climate change for decades. Extreme weather events have had monumental impacts worldwide in the form of high energy destructive storms, floods, droughts, heat waves, and wildfires. All of this have manifested in the Southern African region, and particularly also in South Africa as a country. South Africa has emerged from a prolonged multi-year drought, beginning in the summer rainfall areas of the country, affecting every sector severely with large metropoles like Cape Town coming close to a day zero. Part of the country like Gqeberha, formerly known as Nelson Mandela Bay, is still experiencing drought conditions. Flood events continue with the regularity and intensity that had been predicted in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report on adaptation and vulnerability, with the latest being the rain bomb experienced in the KwaZulu-Natal area this year. These impacts have disproportionate impact on poor and historically disadvantaged households, underlining the importance of building higher levels of climate resilience. This webinar will explain the challenges of adapting to a climate that has already changed dramatically and plans to move forward a much higher level of resilience, the just transition to a low carbon economy. Amongst others, South African government has adopted a national adaptation strategy. The Presidential Climate Commission has also developed a methodology for climate resilient development pathways, which it has applied in pilot areas. The recently released World Bank Country Climate and Development Report for South Africa has provided the first quantification of the investment costs in building resilience and implementing measures to mitigate disaster risk. A cross-section of stakeholders will reflect on these plans and the extent to which they have been adequately integrated into thinking around the just transition. Today, we are going to hear from some of the stakeholders. We are going to have Deborah Roberts, who is the co-chair of the IPCC Working Group number 2. We are going to also hear from Deshiken Naidu, who is the Presidential Climate Change Commission Head of Adaptation. We are going to hear from Dr. Gabriel Lekalakata, who is the chair of Adaptation Network. We also are going to hear from Kaliwe Shibambo, who is part of the youth that are working on climate change. And lastly, we'll hear from the Presidential Climate Change Commissioner, Leboga Mulaisi, who is a Labour Commissioner in the Presidential Climate Change Commission. I would invite all the speakers present to come to the fore. And the first one is going to be Deborah Roberts. And we hope, and I will invite all the speakers that are here to come to the front. And we hope that at the end of the contributions and the interventions, would be able to have a discussion with those present here and possibly with those that are online. We welcome you. I am going to be assisted by Blessing Manale, who is the communications lead at the Presidential Climate Change Commission. We're starting off our discussion or our interventions with Deborah Roberts. She's going to speak to us or highlight the critical importance of adaptation and resilience in Africa and the developing world. Deborah Roberts.
So good morning, everyone, and thank you for taking the time to get out of bed early enough to get here for a 9 o'clock session. We value that tremendously. And thanks to the Presidential Climate Change Commission to providing us with another forum to talk about some of the conclusions that have emerged from the recent Working Group 2 assessment of the scientific literature in relation to impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability, specifically looking at climate change and adaptation in Africa. So what does the Working Group 2 report tell us about Africa? There's no doubt from our assessment that Africa is one of the most vulnerable regions in the world. And that high level of exposure, that high level of vulnerability is due to a very complex mix of socioeconomic, political, environmental, and historical factors. So if we look at our continent, Africans are disproportionately affected because they are employed in climate exposed sectors. We've got 55 to 62% of sub-Saharan Africa's workforce employed in agriculture. 95% of our cropland is rain-fed. We're also seeing across the continent the growth of populations, infrastructure and agriculture in areas exposed to climate hazards, particularly in low-lying coastal areas. And think about the extensive coastline of Africa. It gives you a sense of the problem at hand. In terms of our urban areas, we have 56% of the urban population in sub-Saharan Africa living in informal settlements without basic services. So this gives us a very real sense of how development and the provision of services is critical in providing equitable development and reducing vulnerability across the continent. Africa is experiencing climate change here and now. It's not a future problem for our continent, it's right here on our doorstep. Our assessment shows us that we're already experiencing increasing mean and extreme temperatures across the continent. We're experiencing an increase in the frequency, the intensity and duration of heat waves and droughts. The probability of marine heat waves has doubled. Most of us think about heat waves on land. We also have heat waves in the ocean. Multi-year drought is now more frequent in West Africa. And the Cape Town drought, you can remember that difficult period 2015 to 2017. That drought was 3 times more likely due to climate change. We're also seeing more variable rainfall and river discharge across the continent. And that's impacting everything from farming to energy production. And all of this is resulting in widespread losses and damages across the continent, impacting on everything from food production through to economic output. And for those of you who've been following the negotiations, you know how central the issue of loss and damage is in the political arena. So this is essential for us to realize, is that this continent is already dealing with the brunt of losses and damages. We're also seeing disaster and weather-related displacement and migration of millions of people every year are moving around the continent because of the changes in the climate that we're experiencing. So what are our adaptation options? What can we do to respond to the changes we're already experiencing and that are due to come? Well, our assessment shows us that nature offers us significant untapped potential, not only to deal with the impacts of climate change, but to deal with its causes, and also to provide a mechanism to support lives and livelihoods on the continent. So our natural ecosystems and biodiversity are absolutely essential to the way forward for Africa. Food security can be enhanced by better access to climate information services. We can also improve water management through judicious planning and execution of irrigation and integrated water management. In our urban areas, the provision of social safety nets allow our population not only to deal with the impacts of climate change, but to improve financial security. And given the high levels of poverty in our urban areas, that's absolutely vital. And our assessment points to the fact that however we respond to these challenges from climate change, they need to be inclusive, sustainable, gender sensitive, and equity-based. And this is a major step forward for the Working Group 2 assessment. We've moved from a very strong focus on changes in physical climate system and the resulting changes in the natural system to really looking into the social system. Where are those social tipping points? How do we move forward? We've got a very strong human rights and equity-based approach in the assessment now. But as with everything, there are always challenges. And in Africa, we've got barriers to adaptation, predominantly in terms of information, awareness, and technology. Obviously, finance, you would have seen it in a lot of discussions in the course of the negotiations. It's about show me the money. You know, where is the money that's going to enable this bold adaptation to happen? And it's also about governance institutions and the sorts of policies that are required to effect the transformational change that's necessary on the continent. The problem is we can no longer adapt our way out of this problem. There are very real limits to adaptation. Currently, the adaptation across the continent is fragmented, it's local, and it's incremental. So it's a far cry from the long-term, far-sighted transformational adaptation that's required. And the real challenge is, even if we put our best foot forward, put all the resources and skills that we have available into adaptation, it's not going to enable us to prevent all losses and damages. So there will be residual risk no matter what we do. Furthermore, further warming is going to limit the options we have available to us. So things that work now, for example, nature-based solutions, ecosystem-based adaptation, may not work if we exceed 1.5, simply because those ecosystems will no longer be able to function. We'll also see, as temperatures increase, costs escalating and becoming prohibitive. And therefore, it's very clear that while adaptation is a priority for our continent, we cannot take our eye off the mitigation ball. We must have ambitious mitigation to maximize the number of adaptation options available to us and to avoid as many of these limits to adaptation as is possible. The other challenge for us is not only do we have limits to adaptation, but there's the potential for maladaptation. And this infers that not all adaptation interventions we might undertake would have the desired outcomes. There could be unintended consequences from our adaptation action, particularly if we undertake that adaptation action rapidly in a single sector without thought to long-term consequences. So examples called out in the report include afforestation. This could impact, for example, on biodiversity and water security. Land use and land ownership changes could marginalize the most vulnerable, for example, women on the continent. And we could see competing uses of water, for example, hydropower, irrigation, and the water for ecosystems, creating difficult trade-offs for us to manage. So what is the way forward? Well, the Working Group 2 report, and particularly our chapter on Africa, which is chapter 9, looks to a solutions framework which is more integrative. We refer to it as climate resilient development. And this is about integrating ambitious risk reduction through adaptation with ambitious mitigation, all with a view to achieving sustainable development through the Sustainable Development Goals. And that sustainable development emphasis is really important because it allows us to pull forward in our discussions the importance of equity and justice in everything that we do. So how do we enable that integrative approach? Because it's a big ask. Well, funding research on the continent is absolutely critical. If you look to our chapter 9, they point out that of the available funding that goes to climate change research, only about 4% is spent on Africa. And of that, only 1% goes to African researchers. So there's a lot to be done on the continent to enable knowledge production. But science is not the only way of knowing the world. And there are other ways of knowing the world, and that research must engage with indigenous knowledge, local knowledge, and knowledge from practitioners. As a local government practitioner, I can tell you very often my most valuable knowledge source is the practical knowledge I have, not the scientific knowledge I have. We must fill data gaps, obviously, but we must ensure that that knowledge flows to places where it can influence planning and policy development. Improving climate literacy is absolutely vital. In some places at the subnational level in Africa, climate literacy is as low as 5%. In other words, people don't understand that human activities are driving human-induced climate change. And obviously building capacity for complex decision-making. Governance, another important way of enabling climate resilient development. Inclusive, locally led, so don't forget about your local governments. Equitable, integrated, transboundary cooperation, benefit sharing, all characteristics of governance that enable this integrated approach. Legislation helps us to promote coordination within government, within spheres of government. And ecosystem-based adaptation is a great way of conserving and managing our important ecosystems, but also delivering social and economic value. And obviously, again, show me the money, addressing those finance gaps, improving finance flows. Because the funds that are currently being mobilized for adaptation in Africa are literally billions of dollars less than the adaptation cost estimates for the continent. So it's very clear from the Working Group 2 assessment that urgent action for our continent is needed. Every fraction of global warming counts for us, because you must remember that global warming levels, we speak to averages such as 1.5, but regions are warming at different levels. So for example, in the Southern African region, we're warming twice as fast as the rest of the world. So for us, 1.5 will mean 3, which is pretty devastating. From our assessment, we see that above 1.5 degrees of global warming will enter into high risk for the continent. So regional crop losses, which is problematic for a continent which already experiences food insecurity, increasing poverty, heat mortality, malnutrition, and displacement. Above 2, we enter into a realm of very high risk. Widespread crop losses, we could lose 7 to 18% of our African species to extinction, which is problematic if we're going to use them as a basis for nature-based responses to climate change challenge. And so we clearly need rapid and deep emission cuts to limit these severe risks, ambitious adaptation action, all with a view to achieving sustainable development. There's a lot more information, and these links will give you some guidance to where to find that. I've also put out in the middle table, because I'm certain you don't want to read the 12,000 pages that make up the 3 working group 2 reports. So we've done the reading for you. And the key messages for Africa from all 3 IPCC assessment reports are available in this document there. And I've got more with me if we run out. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Deborah, for opening the session for us and also highlighting the importance of adaptation and also linking that to the practical experiences, practical knowledge that people have, including what sort of investments are needed. We're now going to move ahead and have Desikan Naidu. He's online from the Presidential Climate Change Commission, Head of Adaptation. Desikan.
Good morning, Makoma, and good morning, colleagues, both in Sharm el-Sheikh and hopefully around the world watching virtually. I'm talking to you from a rainy Pretoria today, and very happy to see all of you at the COP. Colleagues, we're switching from the recorded presentation because we want to catch up on some time. So I'm going to be fairly brief, but the full presentation is available for circulation as well as the full video. And this is going straight on from Deborah's excellent presentation on what Working Group 2 has been working on and continues to be working on, because all of the scientists engaged in that enterprise have not stopped with the publication of the report. The knowledge is moving, the analysis is moving, and this is excellent. And I just want to put out a few South African thumb notes associated with climate adaptation, but framed in the just transition, which is the way South Africa is engaging what we want to do. I'm not going to repeat what Deborah said so eloquently. I just want to put this out to remind us that even with the most optimistic scenario, we are in fact looking at an elongated period of adaptation. One of the difficulties that we have is people think that both adaptation and mitigation are events. They're actually long-term marathons. We are going to be needing to adapt for at least the next 80 years, quite probably the next 2 centuries. The second issue to put out is that while our attention is drawn to the extreme weather events, as we have had with the KwaZulu floods and the droughts that are in the country and the high energy storms off the east coast of Africa with Idai and Batsarai, etc., the day-to-day changes inside the system have enormous impact. The heat waves have enormous impact on every aspect of the economy, on every aspect of human life, and it's important for us to understand this. We do want to put out, as we have been talking earlier in the week, that although the Climate Action Tracker puts us a little bit backward on the orange level of insufficient with our overall rating, we do think that with the new NDC, with the just energy transition work, with the just transition framework that is now part of the official policy of the country, we will have an assessment that makes us look a little bit better. This is comforting, but this is far from where we need to be. I should also point out that in the various surveys around the world, in different sectors, the same story comes through. And this is one example. This is the Water Policy Group's work, and its work last year on a survey of 88 countries at ministerial level, water ministers, on what they thought were the paramount issues to deal with in their sector. And this is a little cut from the Africa report. And you wouldn't be surprised that the top end of the water management risks are in fact climate risk related. And this is a story that is repeated right across the sectors, regardless of where you're looking at. So the way we're looking at it in South Africa, and several countries are now in this conversation, and we are starting to get a reasonable convergence around this, is that there are 3 pathways that are interrelated around the transition. The first is adaptation and resilience. We are at this 1.2 degrees above pre-industrial levels. We've been needing to adapt for decades. In some sectors, we've done a little bit that we can be proud of. In most sectors, we haven't gotten off the starting blocks yet. Decarbonization is the central narrative that we are carrying through, but we're quite explicit that this has to be informed by a just transition approach. That while the endpoint is most welcome, that of a low carbon economy for ourselves as a country, in our sub-region, in the region of Africa, and indeed the world, we want to ensure that the collateral damage is firstly limited in that process, but secondly, our work around adaptation, our work around decarbonization must collectively use the transition period to, in fact, organize for us to have a direct impact on poverty and inequality and unemployment in our part of the world, a positive transition, in other words. These documents are available to you. They're on the PCC website. The only thing I want to emphasize here is that we have segmented the justices into three. There's a distributive justice event. We want everyone to have an equitable share of the risks and the responsibilities and the beneficiation associated with the just transition. Procedural, everybody needs to be part of this conversation. So the whole notion of the social conversation is absolutely critical. And of course, restorative justice. We come from a very difficult past, and we want to use this journey into the future to address that past in a most positive way. The last point to emphasize is this, that the adaptation enterprise will, of course, engage the classical adaptation measures as enunciated by Deborah, but also you'll find this enunciated quite clearly in our national climate change adaptation strategy. And as the PCC, we are engaging with the possibility of using one component, one highlight from the Working Group 2 report as a primary thread in our own strategy, and that is the issue of climate resilience development pathways. This is for us as a country. This is also for us as a continent. Agenda 2063 2.0, which is something we're already starting to work on, has to organize itself around climate resilience as a primary wind tunnel with which to develop and implement our strategy. But there is a second component of this that is also very important. As we're organizing for the mitigation measures to become more real, as we organize for these various deals that are happening around the world, including with our own country around finding the finances to decarbonize, and as this, we hope, accelerates into the near future, we also have to have successful adaptation to these mitigation measures towards net zero and beyond. And this is quite critical. And this will be not only for the short term, but for the long term as well. The last point to emphasize, and Deborah has spoken about this, and I want to pull out one specific aspect, is the challenge of maladaptation. And one of the things we have to worry about immediately is that we have 8 years to go to the finalization and the realization of the SDGs. What that means is the world is going to be accelerating around the SDGs, and there is a very real possibility of maladaptation when it clashes with climate resilience, and the pressures are immense. There are multilateral pressures, there are donor agenda drivers, there are service delivery mandates, there are the protests when those delivery mandates are not met, and then there's the issue of technology dumping. The last point I want to make is this, that we're looking at success measures in the form of outcomes in the form of a triple helix. That, of course, we want to have much higher levels of climate resilience. Equally, we are looking at the possibility of the low carbon journey to the SDGs as being, if you like, an early point of catalysis around these climate resilience development pathways that we have ambitiously at national and regional levels all over the world, including our country and our continent. And we want to organize already in the transition, already with our mitigation measures, as well as our adaptation measures, successful and inclusive mechanisms to define our net zero economy. I will stop there. Thank you very much, Makoma.
Thank you very much, Deshken Naidu. That was a brief contextualization of the South African Resilience and Adaptation Challenge in terms of the just transition. We now moving forward, we'll have Ayat Soliman, she is the Director for Sustainable Development, SNE Africa from the World Bank. Ayat, She's going to be talking to us about the investment costs of building resilience across different sectors. Thank you.
Good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. And actually, I'm going to start off by probably repeating a little bit of what both Deborah and Desigan have so eloquently mentioned. But basically, in the context of an exercise that we've done in very close partnership with the South African government, which is the Country Climate and Development Report. It has been launched last week in South Africa and also presented here earlier this week, and I invite all of you to take a look at it. We're very pleased with the way in which it has been done in close collaboration and in consultation with a lot of actors. And this report aims to really look at, and if we can go to the next slide, which is one that Desigan has already spoken to look at, in fact, where South Africa is today in terms of all of these contexts that Desigan spoke about, but then through a series of analyses and modeling and costing, try to visualize where can South Africa be by 2050 through the adoption of these three interlinked pathways. And so in a way, I'm going to be able, or I'm going to attempt to answer the question on what are in fact the actions and then the associated costs that can be brought forward to bring about the adaptation and resilience pathway, but not forgetting that there is a strong link also with the low carbon pathway and with the just transition pathway that impacts on both. So again, in a nutshell, the way that South Africa is today, as we heard also from Deborah, is with a lot of vulnerability. The adaptation pathway is an imperative for South Africa going forward. At the same time, there are a lot of challenges associated with where do you prioritize, where do you put your actions in the next 5 or 10 years, and where also the financing can be best harnessed and in which way and from which sources. So let's go to the next slide. Yeah, we can continue. I think I'm not going to spend too much time on this. I think Deborah has put it very eloquently for the whole continent, and Desigan spoke about the shocks that South Africa has seen in the recent past. Just to say that we've taken all of this information and we've been able to, through the Country Climate and Development Report, quantify and prioritize some of these adaptation actions that will address some of these risks and shocks. Next. Yeah, so you can see, of course, the increase in, so now we're going to come to the action areas, and that's the part where also we as the World Bank are fully engaged in a number of countries on supporting countries in implementing these adaptation actions. So you can see, and I'm not going to go through all of them, the font is small, but you can see in each of these sectors that are most vulnerable, water, agriculture, cities, and transport, there's a series of actions that have been identified and discussed with stakeholders through the preparation of this report that allow us to see how you move from the high level of vulnerability today to an increased resilience and increased adaptation coverage for water, for agriculture, and many of them combine concrete investments, let's say in irrigation infrastructure, with a lot of focus on improved planning, integrated planning, working between national and local government, institutional strengthening, and use of data systems, etc., to improve the way in which allocation of resources is done. So it is not just about the investments themselves, but it is also about how you plan the investments, where you allocate them. South Africa's challenge of vulnerability is spatially very unequal. There are regions in South Africa that will be much more hit than others, and hence being able to do the planning between national and local government to increase the adaptive capacity of those local governments that are going to see more of these shocks is going to be very important. So this menu of actions that are being proposed for each of the sectors is also coupled with, and we can go to the next slide, with a look at the poorest and the most vulnerable. Again, in terms of groups, we see that there are a number of regions and areas, and we can continue to show the slide. Yeah. Please continue. Thank you. So you can look, and these are the regions with the highest vulnerabilities and facing the highest risk. So some of the things that the team that has done this report has looked into is what are the specific measures that you can then bring about to address the regional and the spatial disparities that are included in the vulnerability. So some of the things that are on the right-hand side, and we can go to the solutions, relate to, again, being able to forecast better the weather-related shocks and putting in place early warning systems, data systems, and disaster literacy. And the use of digital tools can very much increase, again, the preparedness of these regions. Also, you can prioritize investments in resilience infrastructure and social services in these regions that increase the adaptive capacity of these poorest provinces. We've seen that in Durban or the water stress in Cape Town. The other thing is really improving the market, the insurance market for climate risks, so that the response from the in terms of shocks, post shocks, is much better financed and quick, can come quickly. And then the social assistance and social response systems are extremely important because it is spatially, but also in terms of the income groups, the poorest are going to be most affected. So how do you allow the poor and vulnerable groups to adapt to these shocks is by having the social protection systems integrate the climate dimension in the way in which it is designed, and making the grants available in terms of the way that the social protection system has its guidelines and payment processes. Let's go to the next slide, which is, I guess, the answer to the question I've been asked to speak to, which is the adaptation and investment needs. No, so this is an estimate. If you remember the 4 pillars of water, agriculture, transport, and cities, these are some of the estimated costs over the next decade until 2030, and then from onward to 2050, both in terms of actual costs as well as percentages of GDP. And it's important to put that in the context of also the damages or the losses that would be incurred if there is no action. These are some estimates that, of course, rely on a number of assumptions, but also the team has identified a number of cost-reducing structural measures. I mentioned institutions, I mentioned planning, I mentioned coordination as extremely important, because some of that improvement in the way that planning is being done, in the way that coordinating is being done, but also procurement. You can focus the procurement methods and the transfers between national and local government to be able to reduce some of these estimated costs over time as well. So that's a summary of quite a bit of work that has been done in the CCDR, and I do invite you to look at the full report if you have the time, and it's available online as well. Let's go to the next slide. So who will pay for all of this is, I guess, a question in everybody's mind. And essentially what we're saying is it is a lot. It's a lot of requirements, and there's not going to be enough financing from any one source to be able to cover it. There is, of course, increased call for action globally that we are hearing as we are here today at COP27, but at the same time, a recognition that that flow of resources hasn't materialized and the damages are happening as we speak. So domestic resources are extremely important as well. Allowing that the private sector comes in with resources to support adaptation is frankly the challenge of the decade, if you ask me. And how do you bring that about is by understanding the context in which the private sector is working, and allowing for the regulations, the laws, the legislations, and the incentives to work for the private sector to put resources in greener and more resilient investments, infrastructures, value chains over time. So understanding what is standing in the way of the private sector to make that choice is an extremely important part of the equation. Of course, government funding is and remains an important part of the equation as well, prioritizing investments that are green, but also increasing the revenues that you can use to tap into to pay for your adaptation needs by including a carbon tax or increasing the efficiency of spending. That is a big sort of part of what we're also looking into with a number of governments to see where can you make savings that you can redirect towards your adaptation needs. I think that's a big context, and of course, in the context of a number of countries that have high debt to GDP ratio, becomes even more important. And at the same time, and similarly to the conversation on the just transition in the energy sector, there is a need to garner international financing for that as well. Let me end with the last slide, which is on the, I will not repeat it, but just to say that the context, the institutional and legislative context in South Africa is quite developed. You have a climate change bill, you have the Presidential Climate Commission, the Just Transition Framework, a number of elements that can help support this whole process. My call, I would say, is to continue using these processes and implementing the recommendations and strengthening the institutional framework that can allow this to be implemented over time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ayat, and for sharing the different options and also what is needed for adaptation costing or what is at stake. And I think it is important also to recognize that this needs a multiple sources of finance, and some of the discussions have been there for quite a long time here at the UNFCCC spaces. So going forward, as adaptation is at a core for saving and for also going towards a low carbon development. This is, I think, the discussions that would be the ones that would inform much of our adaptation plans. Now we're moving forward. We're going to have Dr. Gabriel Lekalakala online, who is the chairperson of the Adaptation Network, and he is going to share with us civil society's perspective on adaptation and resilience as part of the just transition. Mukoni.
Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. South Africa is a testing ground for how we implement a just transition from a carbon-intensive economy and energy system to a low carbon economy that at the same time supports local development. While rightly much focus on the just transition has been on changing our energy systems, as the South African Adaptation Network, we note that there needs to be an equal focus on adaptation and resilience building. Shifting our development trajectories into low carbon, climate resilient trajectories that empower local people to adapt to a climate that already is changing. Civil society organizations play an important role as catalysts for change, translating policy into action by piloting innovative adaptation and resilience strategies and providing oversight and impulse for change. Hence, civil society organizations should be at the center of policymaking and action. Their contribution to the just transition agenda lies in their efforts to maximize social and economic opportunities. Climate change not only impacts us all, climate change will not impact us all equally, as Deborah pointed out in previous speakers. Those most affected are often the least resilient, equipped to adapt to these impacts, thus requiring a just transition to a more resilient and inclusive, sustainable future. Civil society organizations are calling for more inclusion in the development of policies and plans, reprioritization of the efforts, and their implementation to ensure a just transition so that the vulnerable sectors of our society are not left behind due to their dependency on low-skilled work in the carbon-intensive industries. There is an agency to implement adaptation. Climate change is causing more food insecurities, poverty, as Deborah indicated, devastating weather events and displacement throughout Africa. Stories from the ground echo the importance of adaptation agency and how the level of impact of these disastrous events is closely tied with existing development needs. Experiences from communities point to the importance of mainstreaming issues of gender, indigenous knowledge systems, which are built on transgenerational environmental adaptation and meaningful youth engagement, as well as the need to take a nexus approach to addressing climate change, as this contributes towards resilient systems. Women drive resilience, and some of us have lived these experiences that confirms it. The adaptation agenda should put water at the center of all strategies, as it will increase resilience and offer more adaptation options, specifically in regions such as Sub-Saharan Africa, where water is a limiting factor and a finite resource. This emphasizes the need for practical approaches to local level, such as the promotion of agroecology, which combines the need for ecological sustainability, social justice, redress, economic fairness, participation in the context of water security. Civil society are in support of the Just Transition Framework, as indicated, developed in South Africa, and the Climate Change Bill as one of the positive steps towards climate adaptation. The World Bank report for South Africa on climate and development raises the need or raises the agency for implementing these. Call for more support for concrete climate financing for developing nations to support both justice elements of the just transition and efforts to build local resilience to climate impacts, not only reducing the greenhouse gas emissions, as they are most affected by climate change, owing to the prevailing conditions and inherent vulnerabilities. There's a need for climate finance mechanisms to be put in place to ensure it reaches where it's needed most at the grassroots, by unlocking climate finance for local civil society organizations that are well positioned to support resilience building. We call for agency in climate action, from climate financing through to implementation of transformative adaptation options. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ntate Lekalakala. I think what you also raised is the importance of ordinary people, civil society. And we know that civil society had also been at the forefront of shaping the adaptation and resilience policies in the country, or the adaptation policies. So we now moving forward. I'm going to call a representative from the South African Local Government Association, Ntate Mthobeli Kolisa. You're welcome, sir.
Thank you, Mac. Good morning, everyone. We want to start by saying we think that it is appropriate that South African government has placed the whole issue of climate change at the center of agenda of our development. We also wish to state that it is very clear reading the World Bank report that our future as a country lies in us implementing all the three transitions that have been articulated in that particular report. And the same report rightfully places municipalities, especially cities, at the center of those transitions, all three of those transitions. And we accept that. it is very important because nowhere really you could be able to do these transitions and not in the local space. Now, in respect of adaptation, what we want to highlight is that while we have vulnerabilities in respect of our communities and our local economies, in the case of local government, we have the vulnerability of municipalities as institutions now. Why am I saying that? Is that we are getting into all of this in a particular context of municipalities that are financially unsustainable. It's a matter that has been raised over the last 20 years, and ultimately the President of the Republic about a month ago at the local government summit acknowledged and instructed that there is a need to review the funding framework of local government. And that has had a damage over the last 20 years, especially in terms of investment in infrastructure. So we are coming within that particular context. And also, as you know, the municipalities' wealth or the community's wealth, the balance sheet of municipalities rests in infrastructure that is kilometers and kilometers of infrastructure that is out there, that is vulnerable to climate change. When that infrastructure is destroyed, municipalities are not able to deliver services and raise revenue, in addition to the context that we are in. Secondly, when that infrastructure is not, those services are not being provided, also, other than the revenue that you get from the trading with infrastructure services, you also get resistance from payment of rates generally. So which worsens the situation. But over and above that, you also get instability, which undermines the functioning of local democracy. So the point being that, therefore, this path that we have to take is a path that is a path of no option for us as local government. We have to pursue that particular path. Now, the report as well does correctly emphasize that adaptation measures will need to focus on water, agriculture, and as well cities, it does say. Now, water is one of the trading services of local government. We know how constrained Cape Town was, how difficult life is currently in Nelson Mandela Metro, in the situation where we have scarcity of water to provide to our communities. We also know that it is local government that must assist and manage spatial development to make sure that we are adaptive in the way we develop our cities. We also know that it is within that context that we must manage development away from flood-prone areas. We must optimize the resilience of our infrastructure. That is the contribution that local government must make. 2 days ago, here, there was a session that was discussing disaster management. We took experiences from, in particular, Mozambique. One thing that became clear there is that what we still don't have in South Africa is the ability to act when we know that there's a likelihood of events. All we do in the main is to inform communities, be alert, there's a likelihood of something happening, but we don't have measures to evacuate. We don't have measures to protect infrastructure as yet. Those things are things that can be done by local government. But unfortunately, disaster management in South Africa, in terms of the constitution, is a concurrent responsibility of national and provincial government, which then leads to resources being directed to national and provincial government. Resources that become available to local government are resources that come after the event to help deal with the consequences. But then what you need is the ability of local government, maybe particularly the smaller municipalities, to be able to have mechanisms and capacity to act when there is a pending disaster that is projected to happen as a result of climate change. So there's a need really to relook our institutional arrangement and funding arrangements for disaster management if we were to shift South Africa into a state of readiness for the recurrence of what we are now experiencing in terms of disasters. Lastly, in respect of the justness of the transition now, we want to make this point that we note that there is emphasis, a lot of emphasis on what needs to be done in Mpumalanga given the jobs that are going to be lost. About 2 weeks ago, I had discussions on the just transition framework with municipalities in KZN and as well as in the Eastern Cape, and they raised concerns. They are saying that in the main, these are the areas, particularly former Transkei and KZN, these are the areas that are labor sending to Mpumalanga. So when you implement interventions in Mpumalanga and not much in these labor sending areas, you still have problems that you have to deal with in those labor sending areas. So there's a need to also look at that. And it was noted in those sessions that what you find in these areas that I'm talking about is that we've got fertile land that can be a breadbasket of South Africa in the context of what we have to respond to. Food security can be facilitated there. But you need to do certain things. You need to address labor tenure, land tenure issues there. You need to address the issues of roads. We need to address the issues of produce storage and as well as infrastructure related to agriculture. Then lastly, it was noted in those discussions that there's a lot of work that has been done in terms of developing and unlocking the blue economy. These municipalities that I'm talking about are the coastal municipalities that can be used to drive the development of the blue economy. And also, there's already an initiative that is led by the Minister of Cooperative Governance, the one on the Eastern Seaboard. That project we can build on as well. So agriculture, the Eastern Seaboard Development Project are projects that already place us in a way that we could help those particular municipalities. I thank you.
Thank you, Ndate Mtubeli, particularly for highlighting that it's important for us to have preventative measures and be proactive around acting when we anticipate natural disasters or climate change induced disasters. I feel so bad that I was supposed to have called Uceliwe Kala, because the young people, it's their future. And hearing from you, maybe at the beginning, would have made this discussion or interventions much more robust than they are now. Celiwe is from the South African, I'm not sure about the acronym says SAIA, but it's the South African youth that are working around climate change and energy issues. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Celiwe Shivambu, and I am a young person representing Youth at SAIA, which is a think tank in South Africa, and it's the South African Institute for International Affairs. And under our youth programs, they have a program called the YPC, which is the Youth Policy Committees. And I am the focal point person for the climate change working group at Youth at SAIA. And I will just, start by highlighting that as young people, we have constantly highlighted the urgent economic need for adaptation to take center stage. This was at COP26 and again at COP27 when we released our youth statement. In South Africa, young people from across the country representing various organizations, schools and university groups and communities have developed what is now called the first South African Youth Climate Action Plan. And our goal with the SAYCAP was for it to serve to inspire youth-led action and further serve as a guide for youth, decision makers, civil society, businesses, academia, and other stakeholders to reshape our country into a climate just and resilient society. This is after we have witnessed intensifying economic impacts of floods, droughts across Africa. And we have pushed for the greater need to adapt while also cutting emissions, but for it to be at the forefront of global talks. For South Africa, it is no longer enough to mitigate the climate crisis, but we need to adapt and build resilience in order to survive and thrive. The impacts of climate change are unfolding in different ways, as we have heard from our speakers around the continent. And we can mention 0 day, and we can also mention the KZN floods. And these floods in South Africa have killed hundreds of people and have displaced 10,000s of people as well. These disasters are coupled with the impact of COVID-19, just coming out of that, and also the rising international costs of food and fossil fuels. COP27 needs to address climate change as a clear and a present crisis, and no longer a threat that is far away. It is about helping people to adapt to the impact of the increasingly common disasters. And also resilience is to ensure that communities continue to thrive in spite of these climate impacts. And adaptation work has suggested in the SAYCAP forms part of that. And it is to, one, assist low-income and marginalized communities in municipalities in sourcing funding and installing renewable energy projects, and also supporting the installation of energy and water-efficient appliances and technology in low to middle-income households to support the household level reduction in consumption. And also to try and propose stricter environmental and socio-economic impact assessment criteria when sourcing renewable plantation sites, and establishing green corridors and spaces within and between the urban spaces of South Africa to improve air quality, as well as support biodiversity, with a special emphasis on rehabilitating and preserving indigenous biodiversity. Also mentioned in the SAYCAP as a way to push for adaptation is strengthening the adaptive capacity of communities in South Africa through infrastructure development and the creation and strengthening of disaster management policies and risk management plans, as the previous speaker had mentioned, and also awareness raising and training of. And it's also important that we engage the informal transport sector in South Africa in the development of an alternative and green transport infrastructure, and also conduct public engagement processes to determine the best fit for purpose modes of public transport in specific regions, and foster climate research, including social sciences, humanities, design and creative work that support the understanding and realization of social and climate justice. We have also found it important to establish a database that makes climate and energy data more readily available for analysis by external stakeholders, so that policy development is advised by concrete and diverse data analysis. And also establish a wide cycle of recycling and separation at source programs for schools, rural areas, township communities, and urban spaces. And also ban the use of single-use plastics with a phase-out approach by 2030, the latest. Research and support best practices to empower informal traders and individuals contributing to the informal economy in accessing opportunities that will expand their ability to sustain their livelihoods and their entrepreneurial development. Important to highlight is the challenges to adaptation is that the solutions vary widely across the communities in South Africa, countries, and other regions alike. And that depends on the impact and the needs of that community. And unlike mitigation, that means adaptation work needs to be more locally led and with investment designed to build local capacity in the long term. As young people at Youth at SAI, we were also part of the process with the city of Johannesburg when they came about with their first climate action plan. And their climate action plan was built on previous participatory processes, and most recently, the review of the city's adaptation plan. The city then identified, prioritized, refined, and validated climate action for the final cap through a series of consultation workshops, and us young people were part of that consultation. We drafted chapter 6, which is the mobilizing stakeholders, and that focuses on mobilizing stakeholders. And what we tried to do was to summarize the importance of community engagement and communicating and engaging with community throughout the city. And as the young people, we want to continue supporting the city that we live in, which is the city of Joburg. And these are the two things we want the city not to compromise on, which is one, a community focus. It is very important that in the implementation of the city as climate action plan to ensure that the strategies are informed and are tailor-made for the challenges and the context of the individual communities. That's one. Two, it is recognizing that a one-size-fits-all approach will not work. Tailor the mechanisms for policy and strategy development and the implementation for the individual community. And in closing, for the just transition, we recognize that a shift from a carbon incentive economy to one that is both carbon neutral and independent will require revisiting and upholding the principles of climate justice. Therefore, we want to ensure that the people in our society who are the most vulnerable have the lowest adaptative capacity do not end up paying the highest price for the transition to a more sustainable society. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's why I was saying I should have called her first. She summarized it all. And but however, because we have a program, we'll have to continue. I'm now going to call upon another presidential climate change commissioner from the labor sector, Comrade Lebogang Molawusi, who's going to share with us the labor perspective on adaptation and resilience as part of the just transition.
Thank you very much, Comrade Makoma. And thank you for the opportunity to also provide inputs from labor. The nice thing about coming last is that everything has been said, but I'm not going to say that I'm covered as yet. I need to give specific labor perspectives, especially in terms of the adaptation question. Just firstly to say that labor, amongst other groupings in our society, express or have to experience adaptation first as a result of climate risk, but secondly, as a result of transition risks as well. But also to say something else. Africa, I agree, is very vulnerable to extreme weather patterns, but we have to dispel the myth that we are all experiencing vulnerability equally. We don't. Workers, the poor communities that we come from, people who are participating in the informal sector, women, youths, persons of color will experience these vulnerabilities even more. So in our adaptation strategies, there needs to be concerted effort to look at these groupings a bit more peculiarly in order to identify what strategies need to be adopted in order to address such vulnerabilities. My concern is always that because we look at Africa as an aggregate and we look at all groupings the same, we will adopt a one-size-fits-all approach, and as a result, leaving the most vulnerable to fall beneath or in between the cracks. So we need to address, the adaptation question, especially in terms of those that are particularly vulnerable. Now, South Africa is a country that has been experiencing extreme weather patterns. So the idea that we're planning for something in 2050 is a far-fetched concept. We are experiencing the impacts currently. And I think from the perspective of workers, the droughts have been particularly quite harsh on themselves. I think the whole idea around, workers in the agricultural sector, I'm glad that the previous speakers have touched on the agricultural sector. Heat stress in the sector is a huge problem, and it's contributing to absenteeism in the sector. This has a knock-on effect on productivity gains within the sector. South Africa, as well as sub-Saharan Africa in totality, is an economy that still relies heavily on the activities in the agricultural sector. So if we don't address the issues of resilience in the sector as well as adaptation, heat stress has a fundamental impact on productivity within the sector, which has a knock-on effect on the growth of the actual sector and then our gross domestic product. Longevity of crops as well as animal species is also something to be considered in the process. So when we think about droughts, particularly in the KZN region and how it affected the sugarcane farms, this resulted in huge job displacement and job losses. And this is big for South Africa, considering that we had such high levels of unemployment. The recent floods in the KZN area and how this impacted on jobs as well. We know about the Toyota experience where the assembly plants had completely been washed away. But again, we focus our activity on what's the impact on the big industries. We don't talk about the fact that the informal sector workers who are setting up their stalls to provide goods and services for people who are passing by, when those areas have been flooded away, they can't participate in those activities as well. So how does adaptation also talk about not just the Toyotas, because they're the big players in the industry, but also the informal sector workers and the value chain that they contribute to. So workers over and above losing income, they also have to grapple with the fact that they've lost homes. So it touches back on the point that I raised earlier, that we don't experience vulnerability the same way. Other people can insure themselves away from the risk. Workers and the poor probably cannot. If you've built one house in your lifetime, that's it. Getting another home is very difficult, particularly when you are a low earning worker, blue collar worker, and you are poor in our society. So there are proposals, and most of them have already been mentioned. The World Bank report already touches on some of them. So this idea around climate smart agriculture, those interventions are important. Water efficiency and conservation are equally important. Insurance mechanisms for climate impacts, and how do we make use of these to protect wages, and how do we make use of these to protect jobs? In the recent KZN experience, there was this idea around making use of the unemployment insurance fund, the temporary employer-employee relief scheme, to provide temporary wages and allowances to workers as they're waiting for firms and plants to be rebuilt as a result of climate conditions. So these are the things that we can make use of. I know Sasria as well, making use of that to ensure that we can provide wages to those who have been affected by extreme weather patterns. Earlier, I talked about the fact that adaptation is going to be as a result of climate risk, but equally transition risks are something that we're also thinking about. So there is a clear need to help adapt as a result of transitions to a low carbon economy. I think this whole week we've been talking about the just transition and the transition to a low carbon economy and how it affects workers and poor communities. One of the proposals that's coming from the trade union movement, quite strong, especially the South African trade union movement, we've made these submissions in our recently published Just Transition Blueprint for Workers, is this idea around a jobs guarantee. So if an organization is currently planning for their transition to a low carbon economy, how through a jobs guarantee do they make sure that they factor in their workforce, retrain them, skill them, and give them opportunities in the new business model of the organization? So piloting a jobs guarantee is going to be critical in order to adapt our industries and particularly to take into consideration the needs of workers. Those who are not necessarily able to be retrained and reskilled. There's also options around social security, early retirement, and also the processes of natural attrition in the workforce. Another thing that we're looking at, and we've talked about this in our Presidential Climate Commission dialogues around the jobs question, is the idea of how to make use of existing labor market institutions to kind of plan for the transition and the workforce needs that are going to happen as a result of the transition. So how do we look at making use of current collective bargaining to plan for the needs of the workforce of the future? But more importantly, how do we expand our current collective bargaining to make sure that it doesn't just take into consideration formal sector employees, but we broaden our scope to look at how do we best assist informal workers so that we have a broad sense of an inclusive labor market institution. Maybe just to indicate that a number of the things that we've talked about in today's session, we've sponsored a chapter in the Presidential Climate Commission Expert Series, where we talked about a new labor market regime for the just transition. And more broadly, I'd invite you all to look at additionally the Congress of South African Trade Unions Just Transition Blueprint for Workers, where we outline these issues in more detail. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. This has been a very rich discussion and inputs from our panelists, and this is ongoing. The discussions that we're having, the inputs that we're having, the views that we're having, the critiques that we're having are what we are going to be using going forward in implementation of the Just Transition Framework. So the discussion doesn't end now, but for now I'm going to, because in consideration of the time, I'm just going to request one comment online. Maybe Blessing, you can check if there's any comment that you can pick online, and have one person in the audience that can give a comment. And then we come to the end of the session, where we're going to have the Chief Operational Officer of the Presidential Climate Commission closing the session for us. There's you. Can I close my eyes and then just speak at the back? Sorry about this. Just one person at the back. It's been difficult. The whole audience raising hands.
Hello. Well, what is your question? Maybe mine is similar.
2 minutes.
All right. So my name is Amanda Quintana. I'm with the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and I'm focusing my research on climate resilient health systems, which is what brings me here today. I had a question, twofold question. The first is why health is not named as an adaptation priority sector when it's even mentioned in the Just Transition Framework as a demand that the health system need to be protected. And it also is the National Climate Change Response Policy as a priority adaptation sector. That's my first. And the second is, if someone could please comment about the ongoing talks that are happening as we are here in this room in the Northern Cape around the Petroleum Agency, exploring oil and gas in the Northern Cape, and the sponsorship of Anglo American. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm told there's no comments online, so I would risk and have maybe two panelists responding to your comment and question. Anyone?
Sure. I'm not going to talk about the Anglo-American one. I think that yeah, that's a difficult one. Just on the health question, I agree with you 100%. Strengthening our health capacity is what we need as building resilience and an adaptation. As an adaptation mechanism. I completely agree with you. It's probably an omission because we don't have somebody specifically here to deal with the health questions specifically, but I think there is definitely a realization that health is a very important consideration in strengthening our health capacity and our health systems in order to deal with adaptation.
Yeah, if I can just also add to that, I think in the report there is reference in the CCDR that I mentioned, there is reference to building stronger institutions and capacity of various types of institutions to respond to climate, and health is mentioned there. So do take a look. At the same time, the impacts of some of the mitigation options in terms of reduction of some of the airborne pollutants will improve the health conditions. So the whole coal transition has a positive health impact. So there's a lot of dimensions, as I can imagine you also through your research are looking at it in the climate agenda on the health dimension. So both from mitigation and adaptation side.
I just want to add from the IPCC side, we've done a very extensive look at health, and it's a strong component of our Africa chapter. But we've moved beyond health to think about well-being more generally. Because a very strong finding that emerged from our work is that there are physical health consequences, obviously, in terms of physiological limits, but mental health is a growing concern that we mustn't lose sight of in that regard. We also underscore the importance of strengthening health institutions as a critical route to adaptation. So that material is certainly present. And I think the only reason it wasn't mentioned probably because time is short and there wasn't a specific health person. But you can, I've put some summary documents in the middle. You can see for Africa that health is called out strongly.
Deshigan?
I think I'm unmuted now. A very quick response to that. We have actually been organizing for an engagement with the health people in South Africa around the next version of the health adaptation strategy. There is one. It is quite old. It is definitely outdated. So there is a process around that has already begun to engage this. But we're also seeing that in the various medical and health gatherings, this is in fact gaining momentum. SAISA recently, for example, had a whole session dedicated in its annual conference to the mental health issues associated with climate change. And hopefully in 2023, there will at least be a draft product that we can talk to. It is indeed a really critical matter. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you very much. As we continue with shaping and also coming up with strategies on how to implement the just transition framework, this is part of the initial discussion. So we're just going to have continuous discussions. I also would like to invite everyone to continuously visit the website of the Presidential Climate Change Commission, where you'd get some of the presentations that were shared today, and also to follow up on the adaptation and resilience work that is being carried forth by the Presidential Climate Commission, but also ensuring that you also make inputs, you make comments on some of the stuff that is being implemented. I would like to thank Deborah Roberts, the co-chair of the IPCC Working Group number 2, Deshiken Naidu from the Presidential Climate Change Commission, head of adaptation, also Ayat Suleiman, who's the regional director of the Sustainable Development for Southeast Africa World Bank. Would also like to thank Dr. Gabriel Lekalakala, the chairperson of the Adaptation Network. Also thank Keliwe Shibambo from the Youth Constituency. Also thank Ndadem Ntobili Kolisi from Salgam. Thank Commissioner Lebogang Mulawusi. And now we're coming to the end of the discussion today. Not that we're not going to engage further. Future, please visit the website, get in touch with us. And now I'm going to call to Dr. Tuli Kumalo, who's the Chief Operational Officer of the Presidential Climate Change Commission, to give closing remarks. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you very much, Commissioner. And I'm not going to try and summarize and repeat what this expert panel, shall I call you all experts for this moment? Thank you very much for your reflections and for putting forward what we need to be doing generally to address adaptation and resilience in South Africa. I do though want to touch on some key things that you said so that we don't forget. So one of the things that you said, Deborah, that I wrote in my book to note for myself and for everybody in the audience is there is going to be residual risk to adaptation. There are limits to it. There's a potential for maladaptation. So while we are doing it, and we are doing it well, we should be cognizant that we're doing it correctly and it will address what we want to address. We also need to continue with knowledge production so that we can understand what we are dealing with. And most importantly, that adaptation initiatives need to be locally led and inclusive at that level. And then came this again with the putting forward the related transitions, which I thought was also key. Adaptation, resilience, decarbonization, and the just transition as a whole. I think he also had a nice slide with the adaptation enterprise that he put forward. And he also brought forward what the success measures would be. When we have done it, what is it that we're going to see that we have done well? And Ayat, on your part, you brought some key aspects of the CCCDR report, summarized it nicely for us, but you also spoke about financing. The big question about financing climate change adaptation and resilience. Where should the money come from for this? I thought you put that quite strongly. And the institutional base of South Africa, how good? I mean, we're good on the institutional base, right? So we've got a climate change bill in parliament. We've got the Presidential Climate Commission, which does this wonderful work of bringing different voices and stakeholders together to agree on the critical and difficult aspects of the work that we do. And then we had Dr. Likalakala, who strongly emphasized the need for civil society organizations to be in the center of this policy making as it relates to adaptation, and called for more inclusion and in the representation of efforts when we address climate adaptation, and clearly articulated that they support the Just Transition Framework and the Agency for Climate Action. Salka came in with some ability to just put for us clearly what the challenges are at local level and the need to relook at the funding arrangements to address this difficult adaptation challenge. But what I like the most is that you clearly articulated that for SALCA, there is no option. It's not about whether we do it or not. It's the how we do it. How do we restructure our institutional form so that we can address this problem? You went beyond to talk about the importance of early warning systems, but to say we also need measures to evacuate. When you've told people that there's a flood coming, then what? We need to be able to move them to safe places. And how do we protect the infrastructure in that regard? And then Commissioner Lebohang articulately put forward in terms of labor, what it is. But I like just one point from you, the labor sending areas. We've been speaking about that. The fact that in South Africa, we have migrant labor. People could be in Mpumalanga, but they may not all be from Mpumalanga. How do we address that challenge overall? And the youth, of course, sharing the achievements they've made. And I think all of us in the room who are older than 35, right? Youth is up to 35 in South Africa. I could have been youth last week. But anyway, what we like is to see the youth taking this climate change thing, let me call it that, in their hands and running with it without us and showing us what to do. It says, of course, one day we will retire, right? When we've left, there will be even better interventions going forward. We can be sure that when we have retired and we're sitting, they won't be washed away with floods because the youth will be there holding the fort for us. You know, I just wanted to say thank you so much for attending this event and for prioritizing the issue of climate change adaptation. And thank you, Jessica, for pulling it together for us to say these transitions are related. We talk so much about decarbonization and we forget that we can be washed away by a flood while we are talking and we haven't dealt with the infrastructure issues of where we are. And the important aspects of people can insure their homes and you know, go claim to insurance who I think they'll be broke if we are all washed away. And they might be washed away themselves too. But we have a very huge part of the population that cannot even afford that for themselves. Double tragedy. You've lost your job because of the just transition. Now you've lost your home. What happens to you? Those are critical aspects for South Africa. And I would think for other parts of South Africa, and we experience all the impacts of climate change. Other countries are worried only about drought. We have it all. I mean, we're a very special kind, but it means we need to put special kind of resources and efforts in addressing our challenges. Thank you very much. And do keep in touch with the PCC website. All our meetings are live streamed. You'll be seeing us on the 2nd of December as well. Transparency is key. Thank you very much to the panel.
Couple more.